We will be recording. Thank you again and welcome. We are so happy to have you here today. Before we dive into things, it is my pleasure to hand things off to the incomparable Chanel Portia Albert, who is our host for the evening. We thank you for letting us use your platform.
Greetings and good evening, everyone. Ancient Song is really excited to be able to host this really informative teach-in on CAPTA CARA. And, you know, this particular subject is really near and dear to our hearts, and really wanting to advocate and center birthing people and their bodily autonomy, and centering the ways in which they choose to birth their children that is free from harm and unprovoked violence. As we do this work as doulas, we oftentimes witness firsthand the ways in which Child Protective Services has been used as a tool to get individuals to comply with medical procedures. And we are saying no more. This no longer will be tolerated. And so I'm, again, super excited to have, to be hosting this platform and this teaching, and look forward to learning and doing a deeper dive into how we can support community as a whole. And so I'm going to now pass this over to Miriam Mack.
Hey everyone, my name is Miriam Mack. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm coming to y'all from the Bronx Defenders. I'm super excited to be here today with you. So today we're going to jump right in. We have 5 areas of work that we are sort of focusing on. The first being the history of the family regulation system's policing and punishment of pregnant and parenting folks, and particularly those who use drugs. An introduction into CAPTA CARA. We're going to talk a little bit about test and report in New York City and the hospitals here. And we're also going to talk about New York City Human Rights Commission's investigation into test and report into 3 private hospital systems. And then we are also going to do some visioning about what true support and community-based support looks like. Next slide, please. So before we do that, we want to talk about some terminology that we're going to be using, because in this space, we seek to root out stigmatizing language and challenge and tear down the false narratives that have been built around the family regulation system and people who parent and use drugs. So instead of using the terms child welfare, child protection, we tend to use family regulation or family policing or family destruction system, because we know and we have heard from folks who have shouldered the harms and the burden and the policing of the family regulation system that there's no protection or welfare to be found in that system. We try to use humanizing words like a person who uses substances or people who use drugs, as opposed to addict and drug abuser. Instead of referring to drug toxicologies or drug tests as clean or dirty, we refer to them as what they are, either a positive toxicology or a negative toxicology. Next slide. And also, instead of referring, and this was, terms that have been very popularized since the 70s onward, are still being used today. Instead of using terms like addicted baby or addicted newborn, which we know that neither babies and newborns cannot be addicted, we say infant with neonatal exposure of whatever the substance is, infant experiencing neonatal abstinence syndrome. Next slide. So first and foremost, to start, we want to make clear that the family regulation system functions from top to bottom, federal and state and locally, as a system of surveillance, control, and punishment, and has been and continues to be shaped by drug war ideologies. When you zoom out on the family regulation system, certain things become clear about who it targets and how the system operates. And I think many of us know that the family regulation system disproportionately targets Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC folks, with the disproportionality being the starkest among Black and Indigenous people. Just like its sister policing systems, the criminal legal system, the deportation system, the family regulation system functions to maintain structural inequality and hierarchy. It's structured to ensure that certain folks continue to parent on the margins and under the unyielding gaze and control of the government. The family regulation system regulates and criminalizes the lives and very existence of BIPOC folks and poor folks. And I say this specifically because specific alleged behavior or quote unquote parental failings cannot necessarily predict whether a family will be enmeshed in the family regulation system. Rather, it's critical to look at the identity of the person to have engaged in specific behaviors to determine whether or not they will be likely enmeshed in the family regulation system. And what we're going to talk about today really are parents who are both parents and use substances. And you will see that disproportionately it is Black and brown and poor folks who are dragged into the family regulation system because of substance use. And this is true, even though we know that Black folks, white folks, Indigenous folks, people of color, Latine folks use substances at largely the same rates. Next slide, please. So one of the founding sort of mothers of the analysis and critique around the family regulation system is Dorothy Roberts, Professor Dorothy Roberts. If y'all don't know her, please take the time to look up her work and read her work. And Dorothy Roberts has said very profoundly that the regulating and destroying of Black, brown, and Indigenous families in the name of child protection has been essential to the ongoing white supremacist nation building project as much as prisons and police. Next slide. And this is not accidental. In fact, since the early 1980s, the government has been defunding Black mamas and investing in the war on drugs and policing and surveillance and punishment. From 1982 to 2003, federal funding of the drug control funding increased by 400%. Next slide. And we also know that during that same time period, the government chose to fund the government chose to divest from Black communities and fund the family regulation system. Federal funding for removing children from their homes increased by 20,000%. And to be clear, this was a political choice and continues to be a political choice. In fiscal year 2012, of the $6.5 billion of Title IV-E funds, and that's the largest federal funding stream of state family regulation systems, an astounding 51% went to the foster program and 35% went to the adoption assistance program. And even if we look at recent shifts of funding to more prevention services that are provided to children in homes and provided to families when they're in the homes, these services come with the surveillance and control and possibility of punishment by the family regulation system. And this is all done when we know that just giving parents money is the way to support families and to decrease calls to the family regulation system, to decrease what the family regulation system names as neglect. Next slide. So to support, and I wanted to note, to learn more and really sort of take a deep dive into the way in which the drug war and its architecture has really built up and perpetuated the family regulation system, y'all should check out Movement for Family Power's Ground Zero report. It is an incredible report, and we will drop the link for that later in the presentation. So to support this project of surveillance and control and punishment, the government and media worked in concert to create and perpetuate narratives about Black maternal dangerousness and inadequacy. Throughout the 80s and 90s, media outlets saturated viewers with racially coded stereotypes about quote unquote cocaine kids and crack babies. And these articles normatively cast parents who use drugs while pregnant as selfish, morally corrupt, and even evil. And though the basis for these so-called crack baby studies have not only been debunked, but also taken down, the publications like the New York Times have retracted and even apologized for their own role in perpetuating, frankly, what was lies. These narratives still are alive and well today in the family regulation system and used every single day to continue to support the separation of millions of Black, Latine, and poor and Indigenous families here in the United States. Next slide. So hospitals have also been complicit in the criminalization of Black and brown and Latine families, consistent with the trends and the racial disparities rife throughout the family regulation system at large. Black and Latine pregnant people and their newborns are disproportionately targeted by hospitals for drug tests, regardless of whether they even meet hospital guidelines for tests. A major way that families come to the attention of the family regulation system and are pulled into the family regulation system is when Black and Latina people give birth. They're routinely drug tested by hospitals, medical providers without their notice or consent, and those positive tests are reported to the family regulation system. There's often no medical explanation or reason recorded for the why the test is done, and often no medical treatment is provided to the pregnant person, postpartum person, or newborn if the test is positive. As such, hospitals have served as true points of surveillance for the family regulation system. And this is significant because this criminalization intimately links the family regulation system's targeting of Black, Latina, Indigenous, and poor families to the very social service systems that are tasked with helping them. Next slide. So we know that medical complicity in criminalization and the subjugation of Black and Latina people is not new, nor is resistance to this criminalization and substandard care. In the 1970s, here in the Bronx, the Young Lords took direct action against Lincoln Hospital, which was known locally as a quote unquote butcher shop, and made several demands on Lincoln Hospitals for how it needed to shift its substandard care and better serve residents of the Bronx. The Young Lords also established the People's Program, which among other things offered tuberculosis, lead poisoning, and iron deficiency anemia tests to Mott Haven neighborhood residents. Another example is the Black Panther Party, who in fact inspired much of the Young Lords' resistance and organizing. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Black Panther Party created free medical clinics in Kansas City, Chicago, and Seattle, and throughout the United States. And these clinics, unlike the hospitals that were tasked with serving Black folks in their communities, these clinics provided first aid, basic services such as childhood vaccinations and screenings for high blood pressure, lead poisoning, tuberculosis, and diabetes, among other things. Next slide, please.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We look now at an extraordinary new documentary called Takeover that follows the 12 historic hours, July 14, 1970, when members of the Young Lords took over the rundown Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. The Young Lords were a radical group founded by Puerto Ricans modeled on the Black Panther Party. They drove out the administrative staff of the hospital, barricaded the entrances, made their cries for decent health care known to the world. This is the trailer to the film Takeover.
This is a story from New York, not the New York of Manhattan and Broadway, but from perhaps the toughest square mile in the city, in the South Bronx.
I was 14 years old when I joined the Young Lords. The Young Lords were a street gang that became politicized by the Black Panther Party.
We became visible as servants of the people.
One of our targets was Lincoln Hospital.
That building was condemned 25 years ago. Condemned for rich people and opened up for poor people.
It was a place that you went to die.
Lincoln was called the butcher shop.
Blood stains on the walls, blood stains on the floors.
And there was a rat in the emergency room.
We have seen children get lead poisoning while hospitalized at Lincoln Hospital.
So we felt now is the time for us to say exactly how we're going to respond to the killings of our people.
So y'all, I would implore everyone to check out this documentary. It's out now. It is incredible and really talking about the grassroots resistance to medical criminalization and substandard care. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Endra to talk to us a bit about CAPTA CARA.
Hi all, thanks so much for being here. I'm Indra Lucero, they, them pronouns, director of Elephant Circle and an attorney licensed in Colorado. I want to mention first that I am a credentialed attorney, but point out that I didn't learn this stuff in law school, and demystify and decolonize a little bit this kind of information. I learned this, I learned about CAPTA because I heard from the pregnant people that I was advocating for that they were being drug tested without their consent or knowledge. And I heard from providers who really wanted to provide good care to folks that they were told there were these federal laws that required that they drug test. And I got curious and wanted to understand, well, what are these laws? And I just looked them up and read them and figured it out. And I just want to mention that because all of you can and are the experts on this, and we want to empower you to take up this information and bring it into the community and not feel like you need a law degree to be an expert in this. So I just wanted to start out with that. As we've seen from the presentation so far, the current policy environment isn't, natural. It wasn't born this way, so to speak. It didn't come together thanks to thoughtful people carefully working together to do what's best for those most impacted. The family regulation system that we have today has a lineage. Values and beliefs that have existed for hundreds of years informed the creation of today's system at every level. Slavery, of course, is one of those cornerstones. It was many things, including a family regulation system. Next slide. After this country formally ended slavery, many of its key values nonetheless continued into the 20th century, escorted by the philosophy of eugenics. Eugenics was not only a sort of pop science movement of the time, but also a policy platform. And they succeeded in advancing many laws and policies across the country, regulating families and reproduction in a way that we see clear echoes of today. Next slide. There's been a lot of news lately, unfortunately, about unmarked graves of Native American children who were removed from their families and taken to indoctrination camps or boarding schools, as they were known. At every level, colonization is a family regulation system. So that's another echo we clearly see today. Next slide. And of course, we're not the only ones noticing these echoes. This tweet, I think, sums it up well. The former administration's policies are directly descended from this lineage. Though I would note, in contrast to this slide, that Native American children were actually removed from their families prior to the 1870s. But the 1870s mark the beginning of a shift toward a particular kind of indoctrination. Next slide. In more recent history, we came upon a policy crossroads in the 1970s. We see this crossroads in the drug war, but also in the family regulation system. On both fronts, there was a choice. We could have moved toward decriminalization. In terms of what was literally possible, what was before people at the time, decriminalization was absolutely on the table. It was a considered possibility. And we did not go that direction. And we know the consequences of that choice. Similarly, we could have gone in a more anti-poverty direction with regard to the needs of families, the needs of children. And we see this in the Comprehensive Child Development Act. But again, we did not go that direction as a country. And instead, we got CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. Next slide. So just to reinforce what happened at that crossroads, the Comprehensive Child Development Act was not just possible, it was legislation that actually passed. It had bipartisan support. It passed both chambers in 1971, but it was vetoed by Richard Nixon. And of course, that move, vetoing this potential legislation, just aligned perfectly with the history of family regulation that we've seen. It aligned perfectly with slavery and colonization and eugenics policies that came before. To the extent that today, in terms of data, the numbers, most reports to the family regulation system are comprised of what's called neglect as opposed to abuse, which can easily be ascribed to poverty, we can see then the consequences of that crossroads. That had we gone the other direction, we would have tackled or begun to tackle poverty and child poverty, the impacts of poverty on children. But we didn't go that direction. We took the other direction and we got CAPTA. Next slide. So what is CAPTA? Instead of a policy approach that directly helps families, providing direct supports, things like access to childcare, which puts dollars in families' pockets. Instead of that, 3 years later, Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, which is a much more narrow approach to addressing children's needs. That approach funds state infrastructure for regulating families through surveillance and punishment. So you can just see starkly the different things these two laws do. So CAPTA it's a federal law, and it functions by setting standards that states then have to follow. So it does things, it attempts to do things like prevent child abuse, assess child abuse, investigate child abuse, prosecute for child abuse, and treat child abuse. Next slide. So it has no direct benefits to families or kids. As you can kind of see illustrated in this slide, CAPTA creates funding for states. States use that funding to fund the infrastructure of the family regulation system. As Miriam talked about in earlier slides, some of that funding then goes to foster families. It goes to that disproportionate use of funds that Miriam talked about. I can't emphasize enough how this was a choice. We could have gone one way, we went another way. Let's see. Next slide. Actually, sorry, go back if you can. So in this grant program to states, CAPTA sets these rules. If you want this money, you have to do these things, which is basically like, tell us your plan for how you're going to prevent and treat child abuse. CAPTA is where we get the federal requirement for states to have mandatory reporter policies. Just to be clear, I think this is a really important point. The function of CAPTA isn't telling people that they have to be mandatory reporters. We don't have a constitutional duty. There is no, duty built into the structures, the philosophy of our government. What it is if states want a certain pot of funding, they have to show that they have certain policies. I think that's just an important distinction. It's also been a fairly small amount of money historically, an inadequate amount of money to even do what it aims to do. But concerningly, funding for CAPTA has been increasing. And again, this is concerning because it's a choice to resource state surveillance infrastructure and not families. Next slide. So you can see how the drug war intersects well with this policy approach. And in response to the false panic provoked by headlines like these, an amendment to CAPTA was passed in 2016. This amendment is known as CARA, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. It's not surprising based on this history what this policy does and does not do. Next slide. By 2016, the drug war was already known as a failure. So this policy has some ambivalence built into it. This is clear mainly in how the word illegal was removed from the categories of substances at issue. alcohol could not be ignored, especially with regard to effects at birth. But just to be clear, when it comes to the family regulation system, CARA isn't different from CAPTA, it's just part of CAPTA. But the CAPTA amendments is where we get a lot of the policy issues that we see states grappling with today, including how to track families whose infants fit into these categories and how to provide plans of safe care. I do also want to note that this CAPTA language requiring tracking of infants who fall into these three categories affected by substance use, showing symptoms of withdrawal, or showing symptoms of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Other than fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, these are not clinical categories. There's no consensus definition about what being affected means. And there's really no clinical consensus about what withdrawal symptoms are, how they could be measured, or how they could be connected to certain substances. And this is a place where states actually have a lot of room. They can then define these terms. Next slide. So because of how these policies are built upon this infrastructure, there's a lot of confusion / willingness to use them to reinforce systems of surveillance and punishment, although it's actually not necessary to interpret these laws in that way. Here are some important clarifications about what CAPTA does and does not require. So, for example, does CAPTA create a new definition of abuse that's related to substances or pregnancy? No. CAPTA, in fact, CARA explicitly stated that the changes did not create a definition of abuse or neglect or require prosecution. Does CAPTA require all newborns to be drug tested? No, absolutely not. And again, as a law that allows states to apply for grant funding, that's not the kind of mechanism that this law has. It can't force people to drug test people. So no, it just requires states to have policies for notification when babies fit into these three categories. Does CAPTA require the family regulation system to be involved at all? Not really. The focus is on figuring out if families need support and ensuring that there are ways to get it when they do. It doesn't have to be through the existing infrastructure of the family regulation system, other than, again, this is the infrastructure that CAPTA has resourced and created. Does CAPTA say that a positive drug test at birth equals abuse? Absolutely not. It doesn't define abuse at all. This is left to the states. Next slide. This slide illustrates one example developed by a coalition of advocates like yourselves here in Colorado of how CAPTA could be interpreted to best protect families from surveillance and punishment. So what this flow chart does is make it clear that infants tracked pursuant to CARA do not have to be put into the system of surveillance and punishment unless there's additional evidence of abuse or neglect. It also, so that shows that's the red, the red shape or the blue shape. It also illustrates how narrowly the tracking data can be and still comply with the law. These are really two places where advocates like you can resist the power of the family regulation infrastructure. And indeed, there is growing pushback against the racism built into the system, which my colleague will discuss next. I'll hand it over to you, Dana. Or Neela.
Yeah, I'll jump in for just a moment. Welcome to everyone who's trickled in since we began. Before we hand it over to Dana, I was just going to do a little connection between what Indra has been talking about and what Dana will present on, which is essentially the idea that one of the ways that this history of racism that Miriam and Indra has so thoughtfully laid out for us has manifested is this system of what folks have been calling test and report. Essentially, the drug testing of pregnant and birthing people and their newborns without their consent under often the auspices of following CAPTA and CARA, as Indra pointed out. So what Dana's going to speak to us about is kind of connecting that test and report system with the kind of direct action and organizing that has been happening in New York City.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for spending a couple hours of your evening with us. My name is Dana Sussman. I use she, her pronouns. I am currently at National Advocates for Pregnant Women, but I was previously at the New York City Commission on Human Rights, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the work that the commission is doing to address the discriminatory practices of drug testing pregnant people and babies in hospitals in New York City. And it's really thanks to the organizing and the activism and the advocacy of New York City, the New York City community, and many of my partners in this conversation tonight that brought these issues to the commission's attention. In November of 2020, the commission announced that it was investigating 3 major hospital systems, Montefiore, Mount Sinai, and New York Presbyterian, to determine if their drug testing policies and practices violate the New York City human rights law, which is New York City's anti-discrimination law, because they target Black and Latinx parents and infants. A little bit of background on this. I'm just going to skip ahead to the next slide just to explain a little bit of what the commission does. The New York City Commission on Human Rights is a local anti-discrimination agency, and it enforces the New York City human rights law, which prohibits discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. Public accommodations are anything that provides goods and services to the public. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a public entity. So it could apply to private entities, including private hospitals. We believe that the investigation into testing policies and practices at these hospitals is the first investigation of its kind in the country, looking at whether hospitals' practices of unconsented to drug testing violates the principles of a civil rights law because they disproportionately impact or intentionally target Black, Latinx, and other communities of color. And again, we know that because of the longstanding federal, state, and local laws and the racism built into those laws, there is a lot of misconceptions at the highest levels of these hospitals that there's some sort of compliance requirements that they must undertake in order to comply with CAPTA CARA, to comply with their obligations as mandated reporters. But as Miriam and Indra have so clearly laid out, there's no requirement to drug test, and there's no no sort of medical care associated with almost all of these drug tests, and there's no federal requirement to report in most of these contexts. And so the commission this investigation is currently open. Like I said, it was announced last year in 2020. And what's unique about this investigation is that it doesn't have any individual complainants, like what you would know as plaintiffs, essentially. This was brought by the commission itself based on information that it obtained in conversations from, again, many of the partners in this conversation tonight, and determined that it would open up this investigation to gather more information to determine if there are discriminatory practices happening. And what happened after the commission announced this investigation is that a lot of individuals people came forward and said, I think this happened to me. And people do have the opportunity to reach out directly to the commission and talk to their staff and determine if they want to share information that might be helpful for the investigation, or become a complainant in their own case. And people are able to are able to bring those complaints forward. There is a 1-year statute of limitations. So unfortunately, it's a pretty short time window to bring your own complaint forward, but it is free and open to anyone who would want to do that. And so we'll share contact information for how you might reach out to the commission if this is something that you have experienced. And it's also important to note that you don't need to have all the information at your fingertips in order to go to the commission and share information with them. You may just feel like you were targeted because of your identity, and that's enough for you to go and share information if you want to. You can also share information anonymously, just so that they have more information about the 3 hospital systems they're investigating, but also so it might inform future investigations into other hospital systems. And again, you can connect with us about that process, and you can also go directly to the commission. Now, the current investigation that I mentioned, which is currently open, it does not have individual complainants, but the commission is continuing with the investigation. And what we anticipate is that it will likely result in a settlement with the 3 hospitals, or the 3 hospital systems, that will likely include policy change, training and monitoring, or at least we hope that it's moving towards a resolution and that it will at least include these 3 major pillars. And we've also moved to share our recommendations as a coalition to the commission about what we think a settlement should include. And that includes what we think there should be money allocated to the communities that have been directly impacted. There should be a mechanism by which data around compliance is publicly shared so that everyone can access what the hospitals are doing or not doing. That there should be an oversight an advisory committee that it includes people who are who have been directly impacted by the family regulation system and by these discriminatory test and report systems. And there are other components of what we think a comprehensive resolution should be. But part of the conversation tonight is to hear directly from you all about what you think should be included. We are in ongoing conversation with the commission, and we also, again, encourage people can reach out to the commission as well. But we are happy to sort of develop additional recommendations to inform what this resolution would look like. We think, as we said, we think this might be the first in civil rights investigation by a government agency of its kind, and we want to make sure that it has the longstanding impact that we think it could have the potential to have, and that requires community input. So with that, I think I will pass it back to Nilla.
Thanks so much, Dana. So I think Dana kind of led us into what we're going to do next, moving towards a visioning of what we'd like to see in the world. But before we get there, we just threw a bunch of information at you. So we wanted to make a little time for questions. If folks have questions, I think they are welcome to put them in the chat. You can chat me or Miriam directly, or I think it would be okay to put yourself on video if you'd rather share that way. Doesn't look like we're getting any questions at the moment, but I think we're here to answer those questions as they come in. So before we move to the visioning section of our program, I wanted to highlight the slide that we have up, and that is a Know Your Rights website for if you or anyone you know is experiencing harassment, intervention, reporting by the family regulation system. This website has both information on your rights and ways to get involved in organizing and activism. And we'll highlight some of the things later today. I just saw a question come in. The question is, why do you think the definitions of substance abuse and infant withdrawal were left up to the states? Wondering if I could tap Indra for that question.
Frankly, I think it's because it wasn't politically possible to come up with a consensus definition. And certainly, again, it wasn't necessary at this federal level, when basically CAPTA is just a law that says, hey, states, if you want to apply to this pool of money, show us that you've got policies that respond to our requirements. So it just fits with the kind of law CAPTA is and the political moment that this has happened in. Again, there was, by 2016, there was ambivalence about the drug war. A lot of the players who even advanced this policy knew that we were kind of off the mark, but here we were, stuck with this infrastructure. I don't think anybody thought, oh, the states will have the answer, but more so it was like, send it on down the line.
Thanks so much, Indra. I don't see any more questions. We are going to take just a brief break, bathroom, water, whatever your needs are, break. Let's say I will give us, we have a little bit of time, so let's come back at 5:55. And as we move into the visioning section, I would ask that as you take this break, you would start thinking about alternatives for real support and care, alternatives that we want in the world. And we'll pick that up at 5:55. Thank you, everyone.
360, frozen with fear. Whatever happens, whatever happens. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends. Whatever happens, whatever happens. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends. He said, you're not clean. You might deal all the same with that skin. She was looks with her boots left for dead in the streets. Whatever happens, whatever happened. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends. Whatever happens, whatever happened. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends. Whatever happens, whatever happened. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends. Whatever happens, whatever happened. Oh, hey, we are your friends. We are your friends.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us through the kind of learning, growing part of our time together today as we move into more of a visioning moment. I think that so much of the times we can learn all of these things and it can feel inspiring, it can feel overwhelming to kind of imagine how to break all these things down, to begin again, to abolish and divest and then invest into what we want. So we want to take some time after we've learned all of this history and all of this present and all of this reality to work towards what we want to see in the world. Because some folks are rolling out, I just want to highlight that Miriam posted a survey in the chat, and we'd love for you to take that with you and fill it out at your convenience. We'll post it again towards the end. Oh, there's a bit of a tech issue with the survey link, so we'll definitely repost it, and we will be in touch with everyone after the presentation. So moving back to our visioning time together. One thing I know that for some people this is super natural and easy and helpful, and for some people it might feel they might be a little hesitant. But something I'll say is visioning can be about completely reimagining things that don't exist in the world. It can also be about going back to memories or experiences of things that have worked for you, for the people that you've loved, and wanting to try to create those experiences and get those resources to people who don't have access to them right now. So with that, our first question, or with that on a technical level, we're going to use a Jamboard to kind of vision together. And Miriam has posted a link to that Jamboard if you can click on it. And then we're just screen sharing the Jamboard on your screen on Zoom, just for folks who can't or can't participate on the Jamboard. So if you click on the Jamboard, you'll see our first prompt, and that is to take a moment to, I don't know if you need to close your eyes, but imagine for a moment what real support and care would look like for pregnant and birthing people in your experience. And once you have a vision of that in your mind, take a moment to think of one word, maybe many words, but just one word that describes what that care and support might look like to you. And the way you can join in and contribute to the Jamboard is to go to the left side of your screen, and there'll be a square icon. If you hover over it, it'll say sticky note. It's right in the middle of the toolbar on the left hand of your screen. And you can click that and you can type into the sticky note the one word that comes to mind when you envision and imagine what real support and care would look like for pregnant and birthing people. If you're having any technical issues with that, please feel free to drop that in the chat. I see someone's put patience in our chat. I'm going to add that in. I see empowered. I see love. I see not traumatic. It's a great one. Unafraid. Thank you for that. Someone dropped in connection, honest. Transformative. That's amazing. Non-criminalizing, money in their bank account. I'm here for that. Just going to give everyone a few more moments as you get your brainstorming juices going. Repair, autonomy, meets them where they're at. Accessibility, non-punitive. That folks will see themselves as a part of a family and a system. Healing, financial resources, this is amazing. Thank you for your words. We're going to keep going. We're going to use this momentum to get us to keep imagining. Oh, educational. Thank you for that. Stable housing. I think this is where we're getting to our next prompt. So I'm going to move us. I think Dana, you might have to move us to slide 4. Oh, I see a few more in the chat that I'll add in. Or Miriam, would you mind adding those in? Yeah, peaceful guidance. Thanks so much. So the next prompt is, I think, going where we were all taking it. Beyond that one word, as we have that, as we're building that vision in our minds, we're asking, and you can answer one or both of these questions. Where would this care occur? What, where are you when where are folks when you're imagining this? And then what are specific, and we started doing this, but what are specific resources that we want to be available for our communities as part of that care and support. I have in a setting of positive. We are on slide 4. I had some empty slides in there. Sorry about that. Molly shared in a setting of positive support. At the very top of the Jamboard, if you can click this card icon at the top in the middle, there's arrows. Sorry about that. Thank you for asking questions. I'm going to add, we have in safe, familiar places, at home. I'm going to add in a setting of positive support, medical partnership, a safe place to live in multiple places. Programs to keep caretaker, infant, dyad together. I'm gonna add that in. I have, it could be a medical facility, but the ones that exist now are so racist and sterile that I would love to reimagine a new space. Everywhere, we have multiple places everywhere. We have some new place. Mental health support that does not penalize. A program co-designed with participants. Financial resources so that the stress of not having money does not weigh on pregnant folks, postpartum people, and new families. Money. Answers to questions.
Maybe we could go to the next page where there's more room.
Yeah, if everyone clicks over to slide 5 at the very top, there's like a blank. We have comprehensive legal support in a place where priorities for care are set by the people themselves. And just as a reminder, the prompt that we're working on right now is, where would this care and support occur? And what specific resources do we want to be available for our communities? Non-judgmental providers, community control of child welfare community network, more midwives, more radical doulas. Resources include political education to deprogram the drug war, combat the Just Say No campaign. We want providers who come from the communities they serve. We want reparations. Thank you all for sharing. Affordable childcare, quality childcare. pharmacological and non-pharmacological pain relief and comfort measures, healthy and lasting relationships, non-system community-based healers. This is amazing. Educators to teach about resources. Quality, affordable insurance. And something we want to highlight is everything that we've built and imagined together so far, we don't get from CAPTA and CARA. That's not what we talked about today. That's not what we learned today. We don't get that from the family regulation system. CAPTA doesn't get us to our goal of healing or repair, because instead of getting these resources to folks and building the resources people want, it instead puts money and time towards creating an infrastructure of mandated reporting. And seeing the harms of that every day, I'm so excited to be building this, envisioning this with you. We have ample maternity leave. To that end, why don't we move towards our last and final question and prompt. If you can click all the way to slide, oh, we have another one, 7. So if we know that CAPTA and CARA and the family regulation system as it stands is not supporting people and instead putting money and resources towards mandated reporting, towards punishment, what do we want that alternative to look like? We've already started answering that question, but as we continue to vision together, wanting to think about how we build and imagine an alternative. We have tried to prevent poverty instead of trying to prevent child abuse. I remember the grand midwives and long for a space where we learn from these elders who radically supported us while they are still here and build from their legacy and not the medical industrial complex. I think that's so important as we're visioning that we are building something new, but we're also building on things that have existed for decades and then often have been taken from us or stifled or undervalued and under-resourced by these systems, by the family regulation system, by lawmakers, by the forces and the people who pushed through CAPTA CARA instead of putting money and resources into people's hands. We don't need an alternative to mandated reporting. We can just help people. Living wages, funding people and communities instead of systems. What community knows what it needs to support itself. Better support for new mothers and providing free childcare. We have for a policy alternative, federally funded paid family leave that is well beyond 12 weeks and subsidized childcare. Access to stable and living housing and livable housing, my apologies. Fair taxation, tax the ultra wealthy more, universal basic income, universal health care. Building the skills needed to manage conflict and harm that is integrated into all of our education. Legalizing drugs. Comprehensive sex education, consent, and an end to rape culture. Take the money out of the family regulation system and put it into social safety nets like benefits, housing, publicly subsidized material supports. Community designed research to describe problems and identify solutions. This is really incredible. This is building something different. This is building something that we're not offered through the family regulation system and through CAPTA and CARA. Resource, community-based, and kinship care.
And just to really sort of circle back to the point that Indra was making earlier about CAPTA and CARA being a political choice. It's a political choice that CAPTA, CARA, the family regulation system are none of these things. It was a political choice to fund punishment and control over funding access to livable and stable housing. It's a choice to fund punishment, control, and family separation and testing instead of childcare, instead of a universal basic income. It's a choice to not tax wealthy people and to ensure that those who have the most wealth will grow their wealth and continue to perpetuate and have wealth in their families in perpetuity. And it's a choice that many people have been resisting, and many communities have been resisting, and we will continue to resist.
Thank you for that, Miriam. I think that's so important. And I think it's a perfect segue to what I think is our now fixed survey. But we want your energy, we want your vision, we want to build an alternative. If the things that we have were a choice, we're here to push for new choices. It doesn't have to be this way. So I think that survey is there. I know a few folks have asked about recording, so I think we will be following up with folks with probably with the recording and the survey and maybe some more resources. And what that survey will entail is, you know, what are you visioning? How do you want to get involved? How do you want to build together? How do we, you know, speak truth to power and change those choices to build the care and support we want? How do we push to put the money where we know it should go and not where it's going now? To that end, we're wrapping up a bit, but we would love to make a little more time for questions, since we've delved into this a little bit more. And while we give a little time for folks to share any questions they have, Miriam, do you want to start dropping some resources in the chat?
Sure. So we have a lot of resources that we want to connect folks with. Some of these resources and organizers and folks are New York sort of centric, but we also sort of encourage folks, if you have organizers, activists, people that you know are resisting medical criminalization, are resisting the family regulation system, please do drop them in the chat. We would love to have this space be a space to share resources. The first one that we will share is the Parent Legislative Action Network. PLAN is a parent-led, parent-organized coalition here in New York that has been responsible for and really leading a lot of the innovative legislation that is pushing to shrink and dismantle the family regulation system. So please, please, please check out PLAN. And also to join PLAN, you can email advocateandorganize@gmail.com and put, quote, join PLAN in the subject line. Also, if folks are interested in learning more about test and report and some of the efforts that are being made to resist this test and report practice in New York State, and a bill that is aimed at least chipping away at this practice, please, please, please visit www.movementforfamilypower.org/reimagine-support. This is where you can find information about the Informed Consent campaign, and you can also sign up to stay connected and receive emails about that effort. And while this is a piece of New York legislation, we think that this is legislation that can be replicated, and are happy to sort of share resources and information for folks that maybe want to try and push for this in your jurisdiction. Also, and this is something that we referenced earlier, and some of the images and graphs that y'all saw around funding was from this report. If you want to learn more about the drug wars relationship to the family regulation system and how it is deeply, deeply, deeply embedded in the family regulation system, please visit www.movementforfamilypower.org/ground-zero. That's the Ground Zero report. Everybody should check it out. And finally, please link up with us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. We're going to drop our organization's handles in the chat. And also, please continue to share your organizations or share organizers or contact information for folks that you know are working on resisting the family regulation system. And also, I would just highlight that if folks want sort of more technical guides around CAPTA CARA, as Indra noted, CAPTA CARA is something where you can read the legislation and really sort of dig into it. But if you also want some quick guides, I would encourage folks to go to National Advocates for Pregnant Women. Their website has some really good overviews and guides on CAPTA CARA that may be helpful to getting the sort of quick and dirty on that federal legislation. So we will just leave a couple more minutes for questions if folks have questions, but again, encourage folks to fill out the survey. We are really wanting to continue to build from this momentum and continue working with y'all. And we want to hear from you about how we can do that in the most sort of productive and generative way possible. So thank you so much for joining. And I think we'll have some music playing. If you have questions, please drop it in the chat and we'll address them.
Y me hunde la lluvia. Me besas, sueño y miel en mi boca, sueño y miel en la ropa. Ya no tengo frío, ya no tengo miedo en que no tenga nada. A mí me meses solo y ya no quiero mucho, ya no quiero menos que no pueda. Tampoco quiero luego, sino que tengo poco tiempo. Yo no quiero perder. Tú me hacías falta, oye. Si no, no caminé. Cualquiera que toma la vida ganó. Quiera que mira afuera, oye. Cualquiera que esté despierto cobra. Cualquiera que sufre más fuerte y a donde esté, como haga la tierra donde esté, aunque yo me pierda donde esté, dentro de mí ya frases rezan tú y yo. Me miras, soy tuya hasta el amanecer, se nos agotan las horas, me olvido, te olvidas al cerrar los ojos, solo hay melodía. Recuerda.